They held his wedding as if it were a sentence. The entire frontier knew her name, not for her talent, but for the never-ending ridicule. Colton Mercer, the proudest boy in the region, was forced to marry the woman the whole town made fun of. Neighbors bet on whether he would elope on his wedding night. Rivals poured early celebratory drinks. But no one, absolutely no one, saw what lurked behind the silent eyes of Maris Holloway. Press like. Comment the name of the city you're viewing so I know how far this story has come. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about power. Well, the morning of Colton Mercer's wedding, 3 men sat on the fence rail outside Dunnett's feed store and made bets about how long the marriage would last. Harlan Pruitt, who ran the largest cattle operation in Calhoun County and had never passed up a chance to make someone else feel small, said 6 months. "He'll drink himself stupid by Christmas," Harlan said, "and be gone before the snow melts." Pete Dunnett, who owned the feed store and knew every piece of gossip in a 50-mile radius, said 3 months. "Man like Colton can't swallow that kind of pride. He'll light out west and never come back." The third man, a drifter named Cass, who nobody would remember a year later, said 2 weeks. All 3 of them laughed until they had to wipe their eyes. None of them considered, not for a single second, that they might be wrong. The Holloway name had been in Calhoun County longer than most people cared to admit. Ezra Holloway had come out with the first wave of settlers when the territory was nothing but dry grass and rattlesnakes, had staked a claim on 160 acres of rocky land that nobody else wanted, and had worked it until it became something real. He'd built a house, dug a well, run sheep when everyone else laughed at sheep, and died at 63 with calloused hands and a clear conscience. His daughter Maris had inherited the land, the house, the well, and the calluses. What she hadn't inherited was anyone's respect. She was 26 years old that summer, broad-shouldered and full-bodied, in a way that made the women in town press their lips thin and the men look away too quickly. She wore her dark hair pinned up practical rather than pretty, and she had a habit of watching people from across a room with an expression that was hard to read. Not hostile, not warm, somewhere in the quiet middle that most folks found unsettling. The mockery had started young and never entirely stopped. In town she was Big Maris, or sometimes Holloway's heavy girl, said with that particular frontier cruelty that disguised itself as plain talk. Children had been thoughtlessly unkind. Adults had been more calculated about it. She'd learned early to carry herself like the words didn't land, and she'd gotten so good at it that people sometimes mistook the armor for indifference, which only gave them more ammunition. What nobody had bothered to learn in all those years was what happened inside Maris Holloway's head when she was left alone with a problem. Her father had understood it, near the end. "You think different than other people," he'd told her once, sitting on the porch with the sun going down behind the scrub hills. "Not better or worse, just sideways. Like you see the thing behind the thing." She hadn't known what to do with that then. She was starting to figure it out now. The arrangement between the Mercer family and Maris Holloway had been made by 2 old men trying to solve 2 different problems. Ezra Holloway, in his final months, had written a letter to Edmund Mercer, a man he'd known for 30 years, a man he trusted, and had laid out a proposal with the directness of someone who knew he didn't have time for delicacy. His land bordered the Mercer Range on the eastern side. Without a strong partner, it would be picked apart by creditors or swallowed by Harlan Pruitt's ever-expanding operation within a year of Ezra's death. Maris was smart and capable, but she'd need legal standing to hold the property. A marriage to one of Edmund's sons would combine the land, protect the deed, and give them both something to stand on. Edmund Mercer had read that letter 3 times and then poured himself a whiskey, because he had a different problem. His eldest son, Colton, was 29 years old, handsome in the sunburned, hard-jawed way of men who worked outdoors, and had been systematically running the Mercer operation into the ground through a combination of stubbornness, overconfidence, and a complete inability to take advice from anyone who hadn't already proven themselves in a way Colton recognized as valid. Edmund was 61. His knees were failing. He needed someone to steady Colton before Colton's pride cost them everything. He'd written back to Ezra. They'd shaken hands on it 3 weeks before Ezra died. Colton hadn't found out until after the funeral, when his father had sat him down in the kitchen and explained the arrangement with the practiced calm of a man who had decided the truth was easier than the alternative. The argument that followed had broken 2 chairs and lasted 4 hours. "I'm not marrying some woman I've never met because 2 old men decided it was convenient," Colton had said, standing in the wreckage of one of the chairs with his voice about 3 notes higher than he intended. "You'll marry her," Edmund had said, from his seat at the kitchen table, not raising his voice at all. "Or you'll explain to the bank why we can't make the payment on the north pasture, and then you'll explain it to your brothers, and then you'll stand in the yard and watch them auction off your grandfather's land." The silence after that had been the loudest thing Colton had ever heard. "I want to meet her first," he'd said finally. "I've already arranged it." They'd met on a Thursday afternoon at the Holloway place, with Edmund and a neighbor woman named Clara Sims present as a kind of awkward witness to the whole business. Colton had driven out expecting, he wasn't sure exactly what, something easier to dismiss. A woman visibly broken by her circumstances, maybe, or sharp and brittle in a way he could write off. Instead, Maris Holloway had met him at the gate of her property with dirt on her boots and a handshake that was firm without trying to prove anything. And she'd looked at him with those steady dark eyes and said, "I expect you have questions. I have some too. We might as well be honest with each other, since we're not going to get a lot of other chances." He hadn't been ready for that. They'd sat on the porch for 2 hours. She'd asked him about the Mercer operation, how many head, what their grazing rotation looked like, where their water sources were in dry years. He'd answered, a little defensive, a little suspicious of why she was asking. Then he'd asked her about her sheep, half expecting to use it to score a point about the obvious inferiority of sheep to cattle. She'd said, "Sheep are harder than cattle in some ways and easier in others. The land here doesn't always support what we want it to support, so you work with what the land will give you." She'd paused. "Your east pasture, the one that runs along my fence line, it floods in wet years and bakes in dry ones. I've been watching what grows there. If you rotated it differently, rested it for a season, and then grazed it in sections, you'd get better grass in 3 years than you've had in 10. He'd stared at her. "How do you know what my east pasture does?" "Because I live next to it," she'd said simply. He'd driven home that afternoon with his father sitting quietly beside him in the wagon, and he hadn't said anything for a long time. Finally, he'd said, "She's not what I expected." "No," Edmund had agreed. "She generally isn't." It hadn't made him want to go through with it, but it had changed the shape of his reluctance. It was less about her now, and more about what people would say, which was its own kind of ugly thing to realize about yourself. The wedding was held on a Saturday in late May at the county courthouse in the town of Redgate, which was the largest town in Calhoun County and had a population of roughly 400 souls, all of whom seemed to have an opinion about what was happening. The ceremony itself took 12 minutes. Judge Harrow, who had performed hundreds of weddings over the years and had developed a professional blankness about the whole business, read the required words. Colton said what he was supposed to say. Maris said it too, in a voice that was clear and unhurried, as though she'd made her decision and was done being uncertain about it. Edmund Mercer sat in the front row with his hands on his knees and his face carefully composed. Clara Sims was there as Maris's witness, patting Maris's arm with a kind of fierce gentleness that suggested she'd have a few things to say to anyone who gave the girl trouble. There were maybe 20 people in the courthouse, and half of them were there out of curiosity rather than goodwill. Outside afterward, Harlan Pruitt was standing on the courthouse steps with 2 of his ranch hands, and when Colton came out with Maris beside him, Harlan smiled the way a man smiles when he thinks he's watching someone else dig their own grave. "Mercer," he said, with a nod that managed to be both cordial and contemptuous. His eyes moved to Maris with the particular kind of deliberate assessment that was meant to make her feel examined and found wanting. "Congratulations on your arrangements." Colton felt his jaw tighten. He'd grown up with Harlan Pruitt's shadow at the edge of everything. The man was 52 years old, had 30,000 acres and more money than 3 generations could spend, and had been grinding smaller operations into the dirt for as long as Colton could remember. He ran his cattle on a kind of open contempt, the contempt of a man who had never had to doubt whether he would win. Colton opened his mouth to say something that would probably make things worse, but Maris spoke first. "Thank you," she said to Harlan, with a pleasant directness that gave away nothing. "It's a good day for it." She glanced at the sky, clear and bright, no wind. Rain coming later in the week, I think. Hope your crews have the South Creek crossing in shape. It floods bad if the banks aren't maintained. Harlan blinked. It was not what he'd expected. I'll keep that in mind, he said, after a beat. Smart, Maris said, and then she walked down the steps to where the wagon was waiting. Colton followed her, and he didn't let himself look back at Harlan's expression, but he was fairly sure it was not a pleasant one. In the wagon, heading out of Red Gate with the noise of the town falling behind them, Colton said, You know about Pruitt's Creek crossing? I know his south herd has been grazing near that bank for 2 seasons without moving, Maris said. Overgrazed banks erode, it's just math. She paused. I don't actually know if it floods, but he doesn't know that I don't know, so it amounts to the same thing for now. Colton looked at her. She was watching the road ahead, sitting straight, hands folded in her lap, as composed as she'd been in the courthouse. That was a bluff, he said. Everything is a bluff until it isn't, she said. You get to decide which side of that line you're going to stand on. He didn't have an answer for that. He faced forward again and drove, and the silence between them was not comfortable exactly, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of 2 people who had just committed to something larger than either of them and were still working out what that meant. Quad. They arrived at the Mercer Ranch in the early afternoon. Edmund had gone ahead to give them space, and the main house was quiet when they pulled in. The Mercer place was larger than the Holloway land by a significant measure. 320 acres, a proper barn, a bunkhouse for the cowhands, and a main house that was solid, if not elegant. Colton's 2 younger brothers, Ford and Rennie, were somewhere on the South Range, and the ranch hand named Dix was fixing fence near the gate and very carefully not looking at either of them when they drove past. Colton unhitched the horse, and Maris walked through the house without asking permission, which he found simultaneously irritating and appropriate, given that it was now technically her house too. He heard her moving through the rooms, not touching things, he thought, just looking, taking it in. He came inside to find her standing in the kitchen, looking at the stove. What? He said. Nothing, she said. Then after a moment, the chimney draws to the left. You'll get smoke buildup in the northeast corner if you don't have someone look at the flue before winter. You can tell that from looking at it. I can tell that from the soot pattern, she said, pointing. He looked. There was, in fact, a darker stain in the northeast corner above the stove that he had never paid attention to. He didn't say anything. He went to put the horse up. The first week of the marriage had the texture of 2 strangers trying to share a space without making it worse. Colton slept in his room. Maris took the small room that had been used for storage, which she cleared out herself without comment. Edmund had ridden out to stay with Ford and Rennie at the south bunkhouse, giving them room, which Colton was grateful for even as he resented needing it. The cowhands were careful around Maris in the way people are careful around something unfamiliar. Dix, who had been with the Mercers for 6 years and was the most senior of the 3 hands, was polite but reserved. The other 2, a young man named Cutter, and a quiet Mexican cowhand called Pico, who had been with them for 2 seasons, watched her with the open curiosity of people who hadn't decided yet what to make of her. She didn't try to win them over. She worked. On the 3rd morning, Colton came out of the barn to find her in the south pasture, walking the fence line with her hands in her pockets, looking at the ground. What are you doing? He called. Looking at your grass, she called back. What about it? She walked back toward him, stopping to crouch and pull up a few blades of dry grass and roll them between her fingers. This pasture's been grazed too heavy. The root systems are shallow. You can see it in how the grass breaks. She let the blades fall. In a drought year, this pasture fails first, and it looks like this summer is going to be a drought year. We've been running this pasture for 12 years. I know, that's part of the problem. She stood and brushed her hands on her skirt. If you move the herd to the north pasture for 6 weeks and let this rest, the root systems will recover enough to hold through a dry summer. The north pasture doesn't have enough water for the full herd. It does if you dig the stock pond out another 3 feet on the west side. There's a clay shelf there that's been limiting the depth. I looked at it yesterday. He stared at her. You looked at my stock pond. Our stock pond, she said, not challenging, just correcting, and she walked past him toward the house. He stood in the pasture for a minute, looking at the grass. He pulled up a few blades himself, the way she had, and looked at the roots. They were shallow. He went and found Dix. "What do you think about the South Pasture root systems?" he asked. Dix was quiet for a moment. "Been meaning to say something," he admitted. "Figured you'd get there." "Why didn't you say something?" Dix looked at him with the particular patience of a man who had worked for difficult employers. "I said something 2 years ago. You said the herd numbers were where they needed to be, and that was that." Colton remembered that conversation and chose not to revisit it. "We're moving the herd to the North Pasture," he said, "and we're going to dig out the west side of the stock pond." Dix nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." Neither of them mentioned who had suggested it. Chet. The summer of 1882 came in dry and stayed that way. By July, Callow County was looking at the worst drought in 11 years. The creek that ran through the center of the territory dropped to a trickle by mid-month. Ranchers who hadn't prepared, who had kept their herds on grazed-out pastures or hadn't shored up their water sources, started losing cattle to thirst and poor forage. The Mercer North Pasture held. The stock pond, deepened by 3 feet on the west side and now drawing from a clay-bottomed aquifer that the previous shallower version hadn't reached, held water through August when everything else was drying up. The grass in the South Pasture, rested for 6 weeks as Maris had suggested, came back tougher and deeper rooted than it had been in years. When they rotated the herd back in late July, the cattle gained weight instead of losing it. Colton didn't fully understand what was happening until Dix came to him in the second week of August and said, with a careful neutrality, "Branson's outfit is down 40 head. Kellerman lost his bull and 2 cows to the heat. Pruitt's South herd is off by 30% from this time last year." He paused. "We're up 12%. Colton sat with that for a moment. "The pasture rotation," he said. "And the pond," Dix said. "And the way she's been rotating the supplemental feed to build up the weaker animals first instead of the strongest ones." "She changed the feed rotation?" Dix looked at him. "Week before last. Asked if it was all right. I figured you knew." He hadn't known. He found Maris that evening on the porch, doing what she often did in the evenings, sitting with a worn notebook, writing in it in her small, precise handwriting. "The feed rotation," he said, from the doorway. She looked up. "I should have told you directly," she said. "I asked Dix and I should have come to you. I won't do it that way again." It was a straightforward admission, no defensiveness, no over-explanation. He found himself without the argument he'd been preparing. "Why the weaker animals first?" he said. "Because the strong ones will find a way regardless," she said. "The weak ones won't. You lose the weakest ones in a drought, and you've lost the ones you spent the most time nursing through the winter, through branding, through everything. The investment's already in them. Protecting that investment in a drought is just math." He came out onto the porch and leaned against the rail, looking at the dry hills in the distance. "Dix says we're up 12%, he said. "I know," she said, "while Pruitt is down 30. "I know that too." He turned to look at her. She was watching him with those careful dark eyes, and he couldn't tell if she was waiting for gratitude or anger or something else entirely, and the uncertainty of not knowing made him aware of how little he actually knew about her still. "What are you writing?" he asked, because it was easier than whatever else he might have said. "Records," she said. "Rainfall measurements, grass height in different pastures, water levels, feed consumption." She paused. "My father taught me that if you write down what the land does, you can start to see the patterns. And if you see the patterns early enough, you can usually do something about them." "Your father was a smart man," Colton said. "Yes," she said quietly. "He was." There was a pause that was something different from the earlier silences between them, less guarded, somehow. More like two people sitting with a shared weight. "The Holloways," Colton said, not sure where he was going with it. "My father's family came out in the first wave," she said, "before there was a proper road. They had 4 oxen, a wagon, and a box of seed corn, and they planted it in the wrong month and lost half of it and kept going anyway." She looked out at the hills. "He used to say that persistence wasn't about being strong enough to never fall. It was about being stubborn enough to get up when falling didn't kill you." "Sounds like him," Colton said, though he'd only met Ezra Holloway twice. Sounds like the territory, she said. He went inside after a while, and he lay in the dark of his room thinking about the 12% and the stock pond and the shallow-rooted grass in the south pasture that he hadn't seen for what it was until she'd shown him. And he thought about what that meant, not just practically, but about the kind of seeing that was required to notice those things in the first place. He hadn't given her credit for it. He still wasn't sure he knew how. In September, the drought broke with 3 days of hard rain that turned the creek into a proper river again and left the territory smelling of wet earth and grass. The Mercer cattle came through it better than anyone in the county. When the rains came, they were in better condition than they'd been at the beginning of summer, which was almost unheard of. Word got around, the way word always got around in a county with 400 people and not much else to talk about. Colton heard it in pieces. At the feed store, at the water trough conversations cowhands had when they passed each other on the road, at the informal gathering at Kett's Saloon where ranchers talked business and complained about the weather and occasionally said true things without meaning to. What he heard was that the Mercer operation had done something right this summer that nobody else had done, and the assumption, spoken or unspoken, was that Colton had figured it out. He didn't correct that assumption the first time he heard it, and he wasn't proud of that. The second time at Kett's, a rancher named Bowden said, "Smart move resting that south pasture before the heat hit. How'd you know to do that early?" And Colton opened his mouth and said, "Maris saw it. She's the one who worked out the pasture rotation and the pond work." Bowden blinked. "Your wife," he said, with the particular inflection of a man who is having to reorganize a thing he thought he understood. "My wife," Colton said. There was a brief silence. Bowden said, in the non-committal way of a man who was updating an opinion, but didn't want to do it too loudly. Harlan Pruitt was at the other end of the bar, and Colton was aware of him hearing it without looking over. He drank his whiskey and went home. Maris had her own measures of the summer. She'd watched the territory and learned it in the way her father had taught her, not as a series of property lines and legal claims, but as a system. Water, grass, elevation, drainage, the way heat moved across a hillside in August, and where the first frost came earliest in October. She had notebooks full of it going back to when she was 14 years old, and her father had started handing her the measurement stick every morning and saying, "Write down what you see." She'd watched the Mercer land specifically, not just from her own side of the fence, but from inside it now, and she'd found both more and less than she expected. More soil quality than the surface suggested. There was something good in the North Pasture subsoil that nobody had bothered to dig for. Less resilience in the South than the grazing history implied. It had been worked too hard for too many years in a row and was thinning. She'd been careful about how she said these things to Colton. Not because she was afraid of him. She wasn't exactly. He was difficult and proud, and sometimes looked at her with an expression that she recognized as the effort of a man working against his own instincts, which was exhausting to be on the receiving end of, but wasn't the same as malice. He was trying, in the halting way of someone who had never had to try at this particular kind of thing before. But she knew how the territory worked. She knew what happened when a woman said, "You're doing this wrong," directly, even when she was right. She'd watched it happen enough times, with enough women who'd been written off or dismissed or simply ignored until the thing they'd said came true, and someone else got credit for noticing. So she'd been strategic about it, framing things as observations rather than corrections. Asking Dix rather than Colton sometimes, which she acknowledged to herself was not ideal, but was sometimes the fastest route to an outcome. Letting the results speak before she did. It was a calculation she didn't entirely like making. On the evening after the rains came, when the creek was loud and the air smelled clean for the first time in months, she sat on the porch with her notebook and thought about what had been accomplished and what it had cost to accomplish it, and whether that cost was sustainable. Colton came out and leaned against the rail and told her about the conversation at Kett's, that he'd said it was her work, said her name. She looked at him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it's true, so." The logic was blunt and self-evident in the way he offered it, without ceremony, and she found herself unexpectedly moved by exactly that, the plainness of it. No performance, just the fact. Thank you, she said. He nodded, once, and stayed on the railing for a while without saying anything else, looking out at the rain-dark hills. After a while, without quite planning it, she said, "The east pasture, your east pasture, has a rock shelf about 8 feet down on the northern half. I think if we put a well there next spring, we'd hit good water. It would change how we could use that section." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you know about the rock shelf?" "My father drilled a test well on his side of the fence line years ago. He noted the geology in his records. I have his records." "You've had this information since before we were married?" "Yes." He turned to look at her. "You were waiting to see if we'd be worth telling it to." She met his eyes. "I was waiting to see if you'd be worth doing the work with." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he looked back out at the hills, and she thought she saw the corner of his mouth move. Not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "Are we?" he said. "Worth it." "Ask me again in the spring," she said, "when we see what the well gives us." He made a sound that was possibly something like a laugh, low and short, quickly contained, but there. "All right," he said. They stayed on the porch while the last of the rain came down, and neither of them needed to fill the silence, and the creek ran loud and full in the distance, and the hills were dark against a darkening sky, and the Mercer land, their land, held everything it had been given and was ready for whatever came next. What came next, as it happened, was Harlan Pruitt. Not directly, not yet. Pruitt was too careful for that. But in October, 3 weeks after the rains, Colton got word through a cattle buyer named Aldous that Pruitt had been making inquiries about the Mercer East pasture, specifically about whether the deed survey was current and whether there were any questions about the boundary lines. There were no questions about the boundary lines. The Holloway-Mercer combined deed, filed when the marriage was registered, was as clean as a legal document could be. But the fact that Pruitt was asking meant he was looking for something to use, which meant he saw the summer's success as a threat and was starting to think about how to respond to it. Colton told Maris about it at dinner, because he'd started doing that, telling her things over dinner, not as consultation exactly, but as a habit that had grown without either of them deciding to grow it. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Does Aldous know you're aware of Pruitt's inquiries?" "No, Aldous was just passing along gossip." "Good." She was quiet for a moment, eating, thinking in the sideways way she had. "Don't respond to it. Don't react to it publicly. Let him look and find nothing, because there's nothing to find. If you react, you tell him he's gotten to you, and then he looks harder. And if he does look harder, then we make sure what he finds is exactly what we want him to see," she said. And she looked up from her plate with those calm, dark eyes, and what was behind them was not fear. It was the particular focus of someone who had been underestimated enough times to understand what underestimation was actually good for. "Let him think we got lucky this summer. Let him think it was a one-season fluke and that we're stretched thin and vulnerable," she paused, "while we use the winter to build the things he doesn't know we're building." "Like the well," Colton said. "Like the well," she agreed, "and a few other things." He looked at her across the dinner table, at this woman he'd married under protest, who had saved his summer without making him feel saved, who thought 3 moves ahead as a matter of course and still made room for him in the thinking. He thought about the men on the fence rail outside Danette's feed store. He thought about the bet about 2 weeks. He thought about how much they didn't know, and how much they'd never bother to learn, and how that ignorance was for the first time starting to look like a resource rather than just an insult. "All right," he said. "What else are we building?" Maris set down her fork and opened her notebook, and the evening light fell across her hands and the pages she'd filled with her careful small writing, and she began to talk. He listened. Outside, the territory lay quiet under a cold October sky, dry now and resting, gathering itself for the winter ahead. The creek ran steady in the dark. The north pasture grass held deep roots into the earth. The cattle were fat and calm, and somewhere across 30,000 acres of range, Harlan Pruitt looked at his numbers from the summer and felt, for the first time in a long time, a faint uneasiness he couldn't quite name. He poured himself a drink and told himself it was nothing. It was not nothing. The well went down 12 feet before it hit the rock shelf Maris had predicted, and another 4 feet after that before the water came up cold and clean and steady in a way that made Dix take off his hat and stand there looking at it like he wasn't sure what to say. It was the first week of March, and the ground had been frozen hard enough through January and February that they'd had to wait, which had cost Colton more sleep than he let on. He'd lain awake some nights thinking about Pruitt's inquiries, about the way Aldous had mentioned it too casually, the way bad news often arrived wearing the costume of gossip. And he'd thought about the well, whether the rock shelf was real, whether Maris's father's notes were as accurate as she trusted them to be, whether he was betting the spring on a dead man's surveying. The water came up and answered all of that. "Good flow," Pico said, crouching at the edge of the casing and watching the level rise. He spoke little, but when he said something, it was generally worth hearing. "It'll hold through a dry summer?" Colton asked. "That depth, that rock shelf?" Maris was standing a few feet back, coat buttoned against the March cold, notebook in one hand. "It's fed by subsurface drainage from the hill above it. We'd have to have 2 consecutive drought years before it showed stress." She made a note. "It changes what we can do with the east section entirely. The grazing capacity goes up by 1/3 if we have reliable water there." Ford, who had come up from the south range to watch the well go in, looked at his brother with an expression that was careful not to say too much. Ford was 26, quieter than Colton, the kind of man who watched things for a long time before he made up his mind. He'd been watching Maris for 5 months with that same patience, and his conclusion was visible in the way he'd started defaulting to her on practical questions without seeming to decide to. "Third more capacity on the east section," Ford said. "That's, 20, 25 more head?" "Closer to 30 if the South Pasture root systems hold another season," Maris said. Colton looked at the well, and then at the notebook in her hand, and then at the east section of the ranch spreading out beyond the fence line with its good subsoil and its rock shelf and its 30 additional head of potential. And he thought about the men who'd bet 2 weeks. "Let's get the casing finished before we start counting cattle we don't have yet," he said, which was practical, but not as dismissive as it would have sounded 6 months ago. They got the casing finished by afternoon. That evening, at dinner, Maris spread her father's survey notes and her own on the kitchen table and walked Colton and Ford through what she was thinking for the spring rotation. Ford asked questions. Colton mostly listened, which was different from how he'd listened in the fall. Less guarded, more genuine. The listening of someone who had stopped waiting to find the hole in what was being said and had started actually following the logic. Rennie, the youngest Mercer at 23, came in late from the South Range and sat down at the end of the table and ate without saying much. He was the one Maris had the least read on. He wasn't hostile to her, but he was watchful in a way that felt like waiting for something to confirm a suspicion he hadn't named yet. She'd left him alone and let him get there at his own speed. She was good at waiting. She'd had a lot of practice. The spring rotation went in clean. They moved the herd in sections, the way she'd mapped it, and the grass in the rested pastures came up thick and deep-rooted by mid-April, better than anything the Mercerland had produced in Colton's memory. He walked the South Pasture in the second week of April and pulled up a handful of grass and looked at the roots and thought about the woman who had crouched in this same spot in July and seen a problem he'd been grazing past for years. He was building a habit of thinking about that. He wasn't sure yet what to do with it. The thing about Maris, Colton was coming to understand, was that she didn't want credit the way he'd expected. She didn't remind him when she was right. She didn't reference past arguments. She moved forward with a consistency that was harder to be defensive around than any confrontation would have been, because there was nothing to push against. Just the steady accumulation of things that turned out to be true. It should have made it easier. It did, mostly. Except on the days when he thought about all the time he'd spent being certain about things that turned out to be wrong. And those were harder days. He said something to her about it once, in April, in the kitchen late in the evening when the hands were all in the bunkhouse and the house was quiet. He said, "I've been thinking about how long I ran the South Pasture the way I ran it." She was at the table with her notebook. She looked up. 5 or 6 years of not rotating it right, he said. That's grass that took, 2, 3 years to get back to full health? About that, she said. That's real cost. Not just this summer's cost, time cost. She set down her pen. She said, "You didn't know what you didn't know." I could have asked. "You didn't have anyone around you who knew to tell you." "You knew," he said. From the fence line. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. I did. He nodded slowly. He wasn't apologizing exactly, and she wasn't forgiving him exactly, but something moved between them in that kitchen that shifted the ground under both of them a little. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was just honest. The well's going to pay back the first year's cost by August, she said, after a while, returning to the notebook. I know, he said. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from her, and after a minute he said, Can I read the spring notes? She slid the notebook across the table without making anything of it. He read them for an hour. That was the spring. The summer came faster than anyone wanted and brought heat that sat on the land like a held breath, not as brutal as the previous year, but mean in a way that accumulated. Dry weeks, hot nights, the kind of sustained pressure that wore at things slowly. Colton had planned for it. They'd watered the east section from the new well and rotated the south pasture as Maris had laid out. And by June, 3 months into the new system, the results were visible to anyone looking. Harlan Pruitt was looking. The first sign was minor, a boundary dispute raised through the county assessor's office, claiming that the survey of the Holloway-Mercer eastern fence line might be off by as much as 12 feet. It was procedurally annoying and legally thin because the Holloway deed had been surveyed clean by a licensed surveyor 15 years earlier, and the markers were still in the ground. But it required a response, which cost Colton a half day in Redgate and $12 in fees and a meeting with a county clerk who was professionally neutral but personally sympathetic in a way that suggested he'd seen this kind of thing before. Pruitt's done this before? Colton asked him directly. The clerk sorted papers with practiced hands. I couldn't say anything about that in an official capacity, he said, which was as clear an answer as Colton needed. He told Maris that evening. She was already writing in her notebook. He's testing, she said. The survey dispute is nothing. He knows the Holloway deed is clean. He wants to see how you respond. If you come out loud and angry, he learns how close to the edge he can push you. If you ignore it, he escalates. So what do we do? Respond calmly and completely, she said. Send the original survey documentation to the assessor's office, certified, with a cover letter that is polite and thorough and gives him nothing to work with. No anger, no public statements, just the documents. And then? And then we watch what he does next. She tapped her pen against the page. He's going to do something next. She was right about that too, though what came next was uglier than a boundary dispute. In July, their cattle buyer, a man named Garth Whelan, who had been buying Mercer cattle for 4 years, sent a letter through the postal rider saying he wouldn't be able to honor the fall purchase agreement. No explanation given in the letter, but Whelan showed up at Ketz a week later, and Dix heard from another cowhand who'd been there that Whelan had talked to Pruitt before sending the letter and had come out of that meeting with something that looked like a new agreement. Colton went very quiet when Dix told him. He stayed quiet for most of a day, which Maris noted without commenting on. She'd seen his anger before. It ran hot and fast, which was better than the cold kind in some ways because it burned out, but in the burning it could do real damage. That evening she said, Before you go into Redgate to find Whelan, I'm not going to find Whelan, he said. She looked at him. I mean, I want to, he said, but you're going to tell me not to. I'm going to tell you that Whelan isn't the problem, she said. Pruitt made Whelan an offer he couldn't refuse. That's not about loyalty, that's about money. If you back Whelan into a corner, you lose the buyer relationship permanently, and you give Pruitt the public fight he wants. She paused. We need a different buyer. We need a different buyer, he repeated. We have 3 months before the fall drive. I know, she said. Do you know a different buyer? She opened the notebook. She'd been writing letters, she said. 2 cattle buyers she'd found through her father's old contacts. One out of a town called Harwick, 40 miles northeast, and one further north in Colander, who handled larger volume and paid slightly above the county standard rate in exchange for consistent quality. She'd been making inquiries, not committing anything, waiting to see if Whelan held. Now they had their answer. Colton looked at the letters in her notebook. Drafts, corrections, notes in the margins. When did you start this? He said. March, she said. When the boundary dispute came through, I thought it was likely there would be more. He sat back. He thought about March, the well going in, the rotation planning, the spring work. And somewhere in all of that, she'd been writing letters to cattle buyers in Harwick and Colander, quiet and methodical, building a contingency he hadn't known they needed yet. "You didn't tell me," he said. It wasn't quite an accusation. "I didn't want to borrow trouble," she said. If Whelan had held, there was nothing to tell. She held his gaze steadily. "I'll tell you next time I'm running a contingency. That's a fair thing to ask." He nodded. "Yeah, it is." They wrote to the Harwick buyer the next morning, together. Maris drafted and Colton revised, and they went back and forth across the kitchen table for 2 hours in a way that would have been unrecognizable to either of them 6 months earlier. The letter they sent was professional, detailed, and described a herd in better condition than anything else in Calhoun County that summer, which was true and provable. The Harwick buyer wrote back in 10 days. He was interested. The news got around. It always did. By late July, Redgate knew that the Mercers had a new buyer and that the new buyer was paying at Colander rates, which were above county standard, which meant the Mercer Fall Drive was going to clear more per head than anyone had cleared in 3 years. The 3 men who had made bets outside Dunnett's feed store went very quiet about their timeline. Harlan Pruitt went looking for another lever. He found it in the form of Colton's outstanding debt on the North Pasture, a 3-year note held by the Calhoun County Agricultural Lending Office, which Pruitt had quietly purchased from the original creditor sometime in the winter. Nobody had thought to tell the Mercers because nobody was required to, and because the transfer of notes between lenders was not the kind of thing that made the gossip rounds at Ketz. The notice of accelerated payment came in August, on a Monday, delivered by a postal rider who was doing his job and probably had no idea what he was carrying. The note demanded full repayment within 60 days rather than the remaining 14 months. Citing a provision Colton had never read carefully enough, a standard acceleration clause that gave the note holder the right to call the debt early under certain conditions, conditions that the new note holder had apparently decided were now met. Colton read it twice. Then he walked out to the barn and stood there for a while with his hands on the gate of the nearest stall. The amount was $1,100. They had $400 and change in the operating account, and the fall drive proceeds wouldn't come in until October at the earliest. He came back inside and found Maris already reading the notice. He'd left it on the table. "He bought the note," she said. "He bought the note," Colton confirmed. She set it down. Her face had gone still in the way it did when she was thinking hard. "The acceleration clause," she said. "What conditions does he claim were met?" "It says failure to maintain adequate collateral value. The boundary dispute. He's arguing the disputed fence line puts the property value in question." "That's a stretch," she said. "That dispute was answered and closed by the assessor." "A stretch that's currently costing us $1,100 in 60 days. She stood up and went to the shelf where she kept the property files, neatly organized in a way that had been a minor revelation to Colton, whose filing system had previously consisted of somewhere in that box. She pulled out the deed folder, the note documentation, and the assessor's response to the boundary dispute. "We need a lawyer," she said. "We can't afford a lawyer right now." "We can't afford not to have one," she said, with a patience that was not unkind. "The acceleration clause requires the note holder to demonstrate actual impairment of collateral value. A closed and resolved boundary dispute doesn't qualify. A lawyer can file a challenge that suspends the 60-day clock until the matter is reviewed." "Who's the lawyer?" "In Redgate? Dabrowski. He's not brilliant, but he knows land law, and he's not in Pruitt's pocket, which is the main thing." "You know that for certain?" "I know he won a case against Pruitt's foreman 2 years ago over water rights on a small operation near the county line," she said. "Pruitt's people tried to get him disbarred over it, and it didn't work. That tells me enough." Colton looked at her. She was holding the documents with the steady hands of someone who wasn't panicking, and it occurred to him, not for the first time but more sharply than before, that she'd been in this room, in this marriage, carrying things he didn't know she was carrying, building defenses he hadn't known they needed, and doing it without asking for acknowledgement or reassurance or anything at all, really. "What would you have done," he said, "if you were doing this alone?" She thought about it. "Filed the challenge myself," she said. "Compiled every document, written the best letter I could, walked into the review hearing, and made the case directly to whoever was willing to listen." She set the documents on the table. But it's better with a lawyer. We're not alone. She said it matter-of-factly, without emphasis, but it landed somewhere in Colton's chest and stayed there. They rode into Redgate the next morning, both of them, which Colton insisted on because he was tired of her walking into difficult rooms by herself on their behalf. Dabrowski's office was above the dry goods store, a narrow space with law books stacked in arrangements that suggested order but not tidiness. The man himself was 50, compact, with reading glasses perched on his head and ink on 2 of his fingers. He read the acceleration notice in silence. Then he read the boundary dispute file that Maris handed him. Then he took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Pruitt," he said. "Yes," Colton said. "He's clever about this," Dabrowski said, not admiringly. "The acceleration clause is technically valid language, but the grounds he's citing, a resolved surveying dispute, won't hold up to a challenge." He looked at Maris. "These files are organized well. Did you put this together?" "Yes," she said. "Good." He tapped the stack. "I can file a challenge by end of week. It'll suspend the 60-day clock while the review board considers the grounds. Given what I'm looking at, I'd estimate a 6 to 8 week review period and a favorable outcome, but I won't guarantee it because I've been surprised before." "What's the fee?" Colton asked. Dabrowski named a number. It was not small. They could cover it if they stretched, barely. Colton looked at Maris. She gave a small nod. "File it," he said. The challenge went in on Thursday. By Saturday, word was around Redgate, which meant by Monday it was around the county, that the Mercers had lawyered up against Pruitt's debt maneuver and that Dabrowski had filed on their behalf. This mattered because it was the first time anyone in Calhoun County had openly challenged a Pruitt financial move through legal channels and not immediately folded. It mattered in a way that was hard to quantify, but very visible in the expressions of people who heard about it. At Dunnett's feed store, Pete Dunnett told his wife, who told the woman who ran the dress shop, who told her neighbor. And the thing that traveled through all those tellings was not just the legal challenge, but the image of Colton and Maris Mercer riding into Dabrowski's office together and coming out with a challenge in hand. Harlan Pruitt did not panic. He was not the panicking kind. But he did, according to the county clerk who was professionally neutral but personally observant, make 3 inquiries in the following week about other angles of approach, none of which produced anything he could use. The Holloway Mercer deed was clean. The property files were organized. The challenge was filed. And the Mercer herd went fat through August on good water and rested grass, gaining weight at a rate that the Harwick buyer had asked about in a follow-up letter, sounding, if Maris was reading him right, like a man who was thinking about offering a longer-term arrangement. She was reading him right. Ford had started helping her with the grazing records by August, asking if he could, just like that, coming up one morning while she was doing the rotation notes and saying, "Can I help? I want to understand the system." She'd handed him a notebook and started from the beginning, and he'd been a quick study in the way quiet people often were, absorbing it methodically, asking good questions. Rennie still watched from a distance, but he'd stopped looking at her like he was waiting for something to go wrong. That was something. Dix had long since stopped making the distinction between whose idea things were. He just asked her and Colton with equal weight and took the answer from whoever had it, which was its own kind of progress. It was Dix, at the end of August, who came to both of them, Colton in the yard, Maris on the porch, and said, "Kellerman's pulling out." Kellerman was a mid-sized operator to the northwest, had been in the territory for 15 years. He wasn't in Pruitt's camp, but he wasn't allied with anyone against him either, just a working rancher trying to stay solvent. "Pulling out how?" Colton said. "Selling to Pruitt," Dick said. "The drought last year and then a bad spring branding. He's under on the operating costs and Pruitt's offered him a way out." Colton looked at Maris. "That's the 3rd this year," she said. It was. There had been 2 smaller operations, both of whom had sold to Pruitt in the spring when their drought losses from the previous summer caught up with them. Kellerman was bigger, 160 acres and a good water source that happened to adjoin the northern edge of Pruitt's existing range. "He's building," Colton said. "He's been building," Maris said. "He was building before we were married. He's just building faster now." She looked out at the east section, at the fence line, at what was beyond it. We're surrounded on three sides by land he either owns or has influence over. East is us. North is Kellerman, soon Pruitt. West is open territory, no deed holder, just range. Nobody's claimed the West Range. Nobody's made it work, she said. It's hard country. Water's unreliable. The terrain's rough in places. The grazing is patchy. She paused. Patchy doesn't mean nothing. Colton studied her face. What are you thinking? He said. I'm thinking that Pruitt's strategy is to surround and squeeze, she said. Buy the neighbors, control the market access, put financial pressure on the notes. He's patient. He's done this to 4 operations over the past 8 years. All of them eventually sold or folded. She was quiet for a moment. The only way to stop a squeeze is to grow faster than he can tighten. We don't have the capital to buy land right now. No, she agreed, but there are other ways to stake a claim on territory that don't require buying it outright. She looked at the West Range again. There are grazing rights, there are water agreements, there are ways to plant yourself in territory without owning the deed if you move early enough and build relationships with the right people. What people are on the West Range? 3 small operations. One family called the Halseys, who've been there 7 years, running about 40 head in a small grain operation. One older rancher named Tatum, who has 50 acres and very good water but hasn't been able to expand because he doesn't have the capital or the connections. One operation that changes hands every few years, currently an outfit out of the north called the Crane Brothers, who are not incompetent but are also not established. You've been watching the West Range, Colton said. I've been watching everything, she said simply. He was quiet. The late August sun sat heavy on the land, and somewhere on the South Range the cattle moved in a slow, patient drift, and the east pasture fence line ran clean and straight all the way to the hill. All right, he said, tell me about the Halseys. She opened her notebook. She told him. The review board ruled in their favor in the second week of September. The acceleration clause grounds were found insufficient, the note reverted to its original terms, and Pruitt's $1,100 hammer swung through empty air. Dabrowski sent a brief letter. Maris sent a briefer reply thanking him and noting the final balance due, which they paid from the September operating account with $40 left over. $40 was not much, but the note was theirs again. The fall drive was 2 weeks out, and the Harwick buyer had, in his most recent letter, used the phrase long-term arrangement without apparent irony. And on a Sunday afternoon, Colton rode west. He was alone. Maris had offered to come, but he'd said he wanted to make this approach himself, which was not because he didn't want her there, but because he'd thought about it and decided that Halsey would receive a neighbor visiting for the first time differently than a neighbor arriving with his wife in a notebook. First impression mattered. He could carry the plan she'd helped him build without needing her to carry it for him. He found the Halsey place in the early afternoon, a modest spread, well kept in the way that suggested people who worked hard and didn't waste. A woman in her 40s came to the door and looked at him with the guarded courtesy of someone who had learned that unexpected visitors were not always a good sign. Mrs. Halsey, he said, my name is Colton Mercer. I ranch the East operation over the ridge. I came to see if your husband was around and if you'd have time to talk. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, He's in the barn. I'll get him. Halsey came out, a lean, weathered man of 50 with the handshake of someone who meant it. He looked at Colton without hostility but without the automatic warmth of a man who had easy reasons to trust. Heard of the Mercers, he said. What brings you out here? Pruitt bought the Kellerman place, Colton said. You know that? Halsey's jaw moved. Heard. He's been buying neighbors for 8 years, Colton said. I'm not here to tell you anything you don't already know about what that means. I'm here because I think there are ways to work together that make it harder for any one person to squeeze either of us out, and I'd rather have that conversation now than wait until we've both got fewer options. Halsey was quiet for a long moment. His wife had come back to the door and was listening without pretending not to. What kind of working together? Halsey said. Water agreements for starters, Colton said. Shared grazing schedules on the West Range so neither of us overworks any one section. Maybe a shared arrangement with the cattle buyer I've been working with. He pays above county rate for consistent quality and volume. He paused. My wife has been working up the details. If you're open to hearing it, I'd like to bring her out. Halsey looked at him. "Your wife," he said. "Maris Mercer," Colton said. "She knows the land in this area better than anyone I've met. She'll have the numbers with her." He held the man's gaze. "I'll be honest with you, she's the one who came up with most of this. I'm just the one with the horse." Something shifted in Halsey's expression. It was not quite a smile, but it was something warmer than suspicion. "Bring her out," Halsey said. Colton rode home in the long light of the September afternoon, and the territory spread out around him. The east section with its good water and its deep-rooted grass, the south range where the herd was building for the drive, the fence line running straight to the hill, and beyond it, to the west, the rough and patchy and undervalued land that nobody had yet figured out how to make into something. He thought about Maris on the porch with her notebook, writing letters to cattle buyers in March, when he hadn't thought to worry yet, watching the West Range the way her father had taught her to watch things, seeing the thing behind the thing. He thought about the men on the fence rail who had bet 2 weeks. He thought about how small that thinking was, and how expensive smallness could be, and how much it had cost people who should have known better to aim their contempt in the wrong direction. He rode faster. There was a lot to tell her, and she'd want to take notes. The Halsey meeting went better than Colton had let himself hope for. Maris rode out with him 2 days later, notebook in her coat pocket, and sat across the kitchen table from Dale and Nora Halsey for 3 hours, while the afternoon light moved across the floor and the coffee went cold, and nobody got up to make more because nobody wanted to interrupt what was happening. Dale was a careful listener, the kind who watched your hands when you talked and asked questions only after he'd turned the answer over a few times in his head. Nora was sharper on the surface. She'd caught 3 errors in Maris's preliminary grazing estimates and had been right about 2 of them, which Maris acknowledged directly without fuss. And after that, Nora Halsey had relaxed in a way that changed the whole temperature of the room. By the time they rode home, they had the outline of a water-sharing agreement and a preliminary conversation about approaching the Harwick buyer as a combined operation for the following year's drive. It wasn't a contract. It was 2 families deciding to trust each other enough to talk further. But in the territory in the fall of 1882, that was more than most people managed. Tatum, the older rancher to the southwest, came in easier. He was 61 years old and had been watching Pruitt expand for long enough to have strong feelings about it. He drove out to the Mercer place in the 3rd week of September without being asked, pulled up in his wagon, said he'd heard Colton had been out talking to Halsey, and wanted to know what was being discussed. Maris brought him coffee and the notes from the Halsey meeting and answered his questions for 2 hours. He left with a copy of the water-sharing framework and said he'd send word in a week. His word came back in 4 days. He was in. The Crane brothers, the outfit that ran the northern end of the West Range, were harder. They were from outside the territory, didn't have the same stakes, and the older brother, a man named Vic Crane, had the manner of someone who had been burned by cooperation agreements before, and was now of the opinion that the safest position was no position at all. He listened to Colton's pitch when Colton rode out, and he was polite about it, but his answer was that he'd have to think on it, and the thinking seemed likely to go on indefinitely. Maris said to let it sit. "He'll come around or he won't," she said. 2 out of 3 is enough to start. The fall drive happened in October. 212 head. Mercer cattle in better condition than anything else heading to market that season. The Harwick buyer met them at the agreed point and inspected the herd with an expression of professional approval that didn't quite become warmth but came close. He and Maris talked numbers for 40 minutes while Colton and the hands worked the cattle, and when she walked back to where Colton was standing, she had the long-term arrangement in writing, a 3-year purchase agreement at the above county rate, with a volume clause that would kick in if they could consistently deliver more than 150 head per drive. 3 years, Colton said, reading it. 3 years, she confirmed. He looked up from the paper. "That's security," she said. "We know what we're selling and what we're getting for it. We can plan around it." He folded the paper carefully and put it in his coat pocket. He was quiet for a moment, watching the cattle move. "My grandfather would have called this a pipe dream," he said. "A woman negotiating a 3-year purchase agreement with a buyer 40 miles out." "Your grandfather wasn't married to me," she said. He looked at her, and then, for the first time in what she realized was a long time, he laughed. Not the short, controlled thing from the porch months ago, but something fuller, something that reached his eyes. "No," he said. He wasn't. They drove home 2 days later with the payment cleared, the note on the North Pasture current, Dabrowski paid in full, and $47 more in the operating account than they'd had when the summer started. It wasn't wealth. But it was the first time since Colton had taken over the operation from his father that the numbers had moved in the right direction at the end of a hard year, and he sat with that on the ride home in a way that was quieter than celebration, but deeper than relief. Edmund Mercer, who had come back to the main house in October now that things had settled, met them in the yard when they pulled in. He looked at his son and then at his daughter-in-law, and he said nothing at all, which was how Edmund communicated things he didn't have adequate words for. That night, Colton sat on the edge of the porch in the cold and thought about the year. Maris came out after a while and sat nearby, not beside him exactly, but close enough that it was a choice. They'd been circling something for months, not unpleasantly, just carefully, both of them too practical and too wary to mistake proximity for intimacy before they were sure of it. He said, "Thank you." She said, "For what specifically?" "All of it." "That's too broad," she said. "Pick something." He thought about it. "For not making me feel like an idiot while you were teaching me things." She was quiet for a moment. "You weren't an idiot," she said. "You were working with the information you had." "I had bad information about some things." "Everyone does," she said. "The question is what you do when you get better information." She paused. "You adjusted." He looked at her in the cold October dark and thought about what adjusting had cost him, the small deaths of certainties he'd built his identity around, the work of being wrong about things without letting it hollow him out. It wasn't nothing. She knew it wasn't nothing. "You knew what this marriage was going to look like," he said. "Before we were married, you knew what people would say." "Yes," she said, "and you came anyway." "My options weren't unlimited," she said honestly, "but yes, I came because it was the best available path, and because I thought—" She stopped. "What?" "I thought you might be worth the work," she said, "if you were willing to do some of it yourself." He held that for a moment. "Am I?" he said. "Worth it." "You kept asking me that question all year," she said, "and I kept telling you to wait. So." She looked at him steadily. "Yes, so far." The so far was real, not a hedge. It was the language of someone who trusted the ongoing more than the final verdict, and he recognized it as such. He nodded once, slowly, and when he reached over and took her hand, it was without ceremony, just his hand finding hers in the dark, and she let it stay. They sat like that for a while, in the cold and the quiet, while the territory lay still around them, and the cattle moved in the far dark pastures, and everything they'd built held against the night. It was the closest thing to peace either of them had known in a long time. It lasted until December. The fire started in the North Pasture outbuilding on a Wednesday night, 3 weeks before Christmas, when the temperature had dropped below freezing and the ground was iron hard. Cutter smelled the smoke first and came out of the bunkhouse at a run, and by the time anyone reached it, the outbuilding was fully engaged. Dry timber, dry hay, winter dry air, and a wind that pushed the fire east toward the feed storage. They fought it for 2 hours. Everybody, Colton, Maris, Ford, Rennie, Dix, Cutter, Pico, even Edmund, who shouldn't have been out in the cold at his age. They pulled feed bags and equipment out of the adjacent structure, dug a fire break with whatever tools they had, and ran water from the new east well in buckets because there was nothing else. They saved the feed storage. They lost the outbuilding completely, and with it a season's worth of supplemental hay, 2 sets of working equipment, and Ford's entire collection of spare harness leather that he'd been accumulating for 2 years and had never gotten around to storing somewhere better. In the gray early morning, standing in the charred wreckage with the smoke still rising, Colton said, "That wasn't an accident." Nobody argued with him. The outbuilding had been locked. There was no lantern kept in it, no stove, no source of heat. The nearest natural ignition point was 30 yards away, and the fire had started, based on where the burn pattern was deepest, at the back wall, the wall farthest from the door, farthest from any path anyone would walk at night. Dix crouched at the back wall remains and looked at the ground and didn't say anything. "Dix," Colton said. "Kerosene," Dix said. "I can smell it. Can't prove it, but I can smell it." Maris was standing a few feet away, looking at the burn pattern with the focused stillness that meant she was thinking hard. Her coat was singed at the sleeve from where she'd gotten too close to the feed storage, and there was ash in her hair and on her face, and she looked like someone who had been through a very bad night and was now calculating what came next. "The cattle," she said. "We need to move the north herd today. If whoever did this is watching to see what the fire cost us, the worst thing we can do is let them see us scrambling." "Where do we move them?" Rennie asked. He'd barely spoken during the fire, had worked without pause and without complaint, which Maris had noted. He was not as indifferent as he sometimes appeared. "South pasture," she said. "It can hold the combined herd for 6 weeks if we manage the rotation carefully. It'll be tight, but it'll hold." She looked at Colton. "We also need to write down what we lost. Itemized, dated, and witnessed. If this goes to a legal challenge, we need documentation from today, not 2 months from now." "You think it goes to a legal challenge?" Colton said. "I think Pruitt is too careful to do something like this without a plausible alternative explanation ready," she said. "He'll have an alibi, and his people will have alibis, and the only thing that matters in that situation is whether we've built our own record better than he's built his." She paused. "So we document everything. We tell no one what we suspect, and we figure out who was on that road last night." "The county road runs past the north pasture," Ford said. "I know," she said. "Cutter," Colton said. "Did you see anything? Any rider? Any wagon before you smelled the smoke?" Cutter was 22, young enough that the fire had shaken him in a way he was trying not to show. He thought about it. "Wagon," he said. "Maybe an hour before I smelled it. I figured it was somebody coming back from Redgate late." "What kind of wagon?" "I don't know. I wasn't paying attention. It was dark." He paused. "It was moving slow. I remember thinking it was moving slow for how cold it was." Maris wrote that down. They spent the rest of the morning doing what she'd said. Documenting losses, writing statements, moving the north herd south with Dix running the rotation while Colton and Ford and Rennie and Maris worked the records. Edmund sat at the kitchen table and wrote in his careful old man's hand while Maris dictated, which was the best use of him that kept him out of the cold. By midday, they had 3 pages of documentation dated and witnessed. Maris sent Pico to Redgate with 2 letters, one to Dabrowski, outlining the situation and asking what legal options existed for arson claims with circumstantial evidence, and one to the county sheriff's office, which was a formality she didn't expect much from, but which established a public record of the incident. The sheriff's deputy who came out 2 days later was not unpleasant, but he was also not motivated. He looked at the burn site, took notes, said he'd look into it, and left. His looking into it produced nothing visible in the following weeks. Dabrowski's response was more useful. He outlined the evidentiary requirements for arson claims, confirmed that the itemized loss documentation was correctly formatted, and noted, carefully, with appropriate legal hedging, that if there was a pattern of interference that could be demonstrated over time, a civil damages claim became viable even when criminal prosecution was not. A pattern, Maris thought. She got out her notebook, not the current one, but the one from the previous year and the one before that. She'd been keeping records of everything since she was 14: weather, land conditions, market prices, events. She started going through them and marking anything that touched on Pruitt's operations or the operations he'd eventually absorbed. It took 3 evenings. When she was done, she had 7 years of documented pattern. The sequence of boundary disputes, note purchases, buyer manipulations, and what she now suspected was at least one previous incident of property interference against the Branson outfit before it sold, though that one was older and harder to establish. She showed it to Colton on a Sunday night. He read through it slowly. His expression changed as he went, not toward anger, though anger was underneath it, but toward something colder and more focused. "This isn't just him being aggressive," he said. "No," she said. "It's a system. He runs each piece of it separately, so no individual piece looks like anything more than business. But together," she tapped the pages. "Together it's a campaign. He picks an operation, creates financial pressure, adds legal friction, waits for the pressure to crack something, and then moves in. And we're the operation he's picked. We've been the operation he's picked since the South pasture outperformed his herd in the drought year," she said. "That's when we became a problem. Before that, we were just small enough to ignore. Colton set the pages down. Dabrowski said a pattern supports a civil claim. It does, she said, but a civil claim takes time and money, and we need the money for the spring. She paused. What we need right now is to not lose anything else, and we need to keep building what we're building with Halsey and Tatum, because that's the actual long-term answer to what Pruitt is doing. The alliance, Colton said. It's not enough to defend ourselves, she said. Defense only slows the squeeze. We need to grow large enough and connected enough that squeezing us costs him more than it gains him. She looked at the pages. That's the math. We need to change the math. He was quiet for a long time. The West Range, he said. The West Range, she said. They'd talked about it in the fall, in the abstract. Now, it was not abstract. The West Range, rough and patchy and not obviously valuable, was the one direction Pruitt wasn't coming from, and it was the direction they'd started building relationships. Halsey and Tatum were West Range. The Crane brothers were West Range. If we can establish a proper cooperative with Halsey and Tatum, she said, coordinate grazing rights on the undeeded west sections, run our drives jointly to hit the Harwick buyer's volume clause, we stop being three small operations that can be pressured individually and start being one mid-sized operation that's harder to touch. Cooperatives don't have a great history in this territory, Colton said. Because they were built on goodwill and handshakes, she said. I'm talking about something with written agreements, legal structure, something that costs all parties something to break, not just socially, but materially. He looked at her. You've been working on this, he said. Since September, she said, when Kellerman sold. He leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and she let him look because she knew he was not doubting her. He was calculating, measuring what it would cost and what it would require, and whether they were capable of it. That was a different thing from doubt. The Crane brothers, he said. Vic Crane said no. Vic Crane hasn't had his outbuilding burned down yet, she said quietly. There was a silence. You think Pruitt goes after them next, Colton said. I think if Pruitt is running a system, we're not the only target in that system, she said. We were convenient because of our location and our success last year, but Halsey has good water and Tatum has 50 acres that adjoin Pruitt's northwest boundary, and the Crane brothers have the access road through the north end of the West Range that controls movement through that whole section. She paused. He'll get to all of them eventually. The question is whether we build something before he gets there or after. Colton picked up the pages again and looked at them without reading, just holding them. I want to call a meeting, he said. Halsey, Tatum, the Crane, Barsins, all of them. So do I, she said. I want to put this on the table. He meant the documentation, the pattern sheet assembled. I want them to see what they're looking at. It'll scare some of them. Good, he said. Scared people who understand the situation are better partners than comfortable people who don't. She considered him for a moment. This man who had come so far from the person who'd argued about chairs and refused to see the shallow-rooted grass for what it was. Not transformed, not perfected. Still difficult sometimes. Still proud in ways that got him into unnecessary trouble. Still capable of choosing the harder path just to prove he could walk it. But genuinely changed in the places that mattered. Scared and informed, she said. That's a reasonable combination. Can you put together the presentation? He said. The documentation, organized for people who haven't seen it before. Yes, she said. And I'll write out to the Crane brothers again, he said, before the meeting. What will you say to Vic that you haven't said? He thought about it. I'll show him the burn site, he said. I won't say anything. I'll just show him. She nodded slowly. It was the right instinct, better than argument, better than data. Some truths landed better when they were visible rather than explained. They held the meeting at the Halsey place on a Saturday in January, in the barn because the house wasn't big enough for 5 families, and the cold didn't allow for anything outside. Nora Halsey put coffee on a camp stove in the corner, and it ran out twice, and she made more without being asked. Dale Halsey and Old Tatum sat at the work table. The Crane brothers, Vic and his younger brother Lee, who had a different manner than Vic, quieter and more careful, stood at the edge of the lamplight. Colton had brought Ford. Rennie had wanted to come, and Colton had said yes, which was new. Maris stood at the work table and laid out the documentation. She talked for 40 minutes. She didn't editorialize and she didn't perform outrage. She just walked them through what the record showed, one piece at a time, in the flat, factual way of someone reporting what is rather than arguing what should be. The survey dispute, the note purchase, the buyer manipulation, the fire, the pattern across 7 years and 4 absorbed operations. When she finished, the barn was quiet except for the camp stove and the distant sound of wind against the walls. Tatum said, "I knew about the Branson place." He said it to no one in particular. "I knew that sale was wrong, but I couldn't say how I knew." "It's because it was wrong," Dale Halsey said. He was looking at the documentation with the expression of a man who was angry and trying to be useful with it. "What happens if we form this cooperative and he decides to run the same play on us?" "He'll try," Maris said. "He's going to try regardless. The cooperative doesn't make us immune. It makes us expensive. It makes each of us more expensive to attack because an attack on one becomes visible to all, and we all respond together, legally, through the buyer relationship, through coordinated grazing that fills any gap one operation can't cover." "It has to be written down," Lee Crane said. It was the first time he'd spoken. His brother looked at him. "You said legal structure, binding to all parties. What does that look like in practice?" "Dabrowski has drafted a framework," Maris said. "It's not perfect. Nothing is the first time. But it establishes shared water rights on the undeeded west sections, coordinated grazing schedules, a shared purchasing relationship with the Harwick buyer, and a mutual obligation to pool resources in response to any documented interference against a member operation." She paused. "You'd all be giving something up. You'd all be committing to respond when it's not your property being attacked. That's the cost." Vic Crane had not spoken since he'd sat down. He'd listened with his arms crossed and his face closed. Now he uncrossed his arms. "Colton brought me to your burn site," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Colton said. "I've seen a kerosene fire before," Vic said. "The smell doesn't go away fast." He looked at the table. "Lee and I have been running our operation for 6 years. We built it from nothing up north and brought it down here because the land was good and the price was right." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't want to lose it to a man who buys notes and burns buildings and calls it business." The barn was very still. "Neither do we," Dale Halsey said. "Neither does anyone here," Tatum said. Vic Crane looked at Maris across the table. "The framework Dabrowski drafted, what does it cost to review it?" "I have a copy," she said, and put it on the table. He picked it up. Lee leaned over to read it with him. The lamp flickered in a draft from the wall, and the shadows moved across the faces of 5 families sitting in a barn in January, deciding whether to trust each other with something real. Ford, who had said almost nothing the entire meeting, leaned over to Colton and said quietly, "Grandfather would not believe this." "No," Colton said. "He wouldn't." The framework took 2 more weeks of back and forth before all parties were satisfied with the language. There were arguments. Dale Halsey wanted stronger language on the grazing penalty clause. Vic Crane wanted a sunset provision that Maris pushed back on, and Tatum kept circling back to a concern about water priority in a 3rd consecutive drought year that was actually valid and took an evening of revision to properly address. Real negotiations, messy and specific and occasionally frustrating. The document they signed on a February evening at the Mercer kitchen table was not the document Dabrowski had originally drafted. It was better, because 5 different sets of concerns had been worked into it until it was something all of them could stand behind. Maris signed last. She pressed the pen to the paper and thought about her father writing letters to Edmund Mercer, 2 old men trading proposals across a fence line, trying to build something that would outlast them. She thought about the porch and the shallow-rooted grass, and the stock pond and the 3-year purchase agreement folded in Colton's coat pocket. She thought about everything that had been called impossible or unreasonable, or not how things were done. She signed her name and set down the pen. Colton looked at the document and then at her. "What happens now?" Rennie said from his chair at the end of the table, the first words he'd said all evening. Now we build, Colton said. But Maris was already thinking about the spring and the West Range, and the things Pruitt didn't know they were building, and the ways that what looked like defense was actually something else entirely, and the fact that the math, the real math, the kind that mattered, was finally starting to move in their direction. Outside, February sat cold and patient on the land. The cattle were quiet in the dark pastures. The creek ran steady under a skin of ice that would be gone by March. And across 30,000 acres of range that had been certain, until very recently, that this story would end the way stories like this always ended. Something had shifted, quietly, stubbornly, one documented fact and one honest conversation and one signed name at a time. The spring was coming. Harlan Pruitt didn't know yet what that meant. He was about to find out. The spring of 1883 came in wet and cold, which was the opposite of what they'd feared and brought its own set of problems. But the cooperative was structured for problems now in a way that none of the 5 operations had been before. The water-sharing agreement that had seemed forward-looking in February became immediately practical in March, when the creek system flooded the Halsey low pasture and Dale needed to move 40 head to higher ground on short notice. The grazing schedule allowed for it without negotiation. The mechanism was already in the document, already agreed, and it worked on a Tuesday morning in mud and cold rain without anyone having to ask anyone for a favor. Dale mentioned it afterward to Colton at the feed store, not making a big thing of it, just saying, "That clause Maris put in about emergency pasture access, used it Tuesday." "Did it work?" Colton said. "Moved the herd before I lost any," Dale said. "So yes." Word of that got around. Small things do, in small counties. Maris was tracking something she didn't fully name yet, even to herself, a shift in the texture of how people talked to her in Redgate. Not dramatic, not a sudden transformation, just the accumulated weight of a year of results slowly changing the register in which people addressed her. The dry goods clerk, who had always been professionally pleasant, now asked her opinion on the spring supply orders. Nora Halsey had started writing to her between visits, practical letters about grazing and feed, and one letter about a cow with an unusual joint ailment that Maris answered in detail. At the feed store, Pete Dannett had stopped the slow half-second pause before acknowledging her, the pause that told you someone was deciding whether you were worth full attention, and now just talked to her like a person whose time had value. These were small things, but she had been collecting small things for 26 years and knew how they added up. Colton noticed it too, in the way you notice something about a place when you come back to it after being away. Not because it's changed overnight, but because the distance gives you perspective on a change that's been accumulating. He noticed it specifically at the spring branding, which the cooperative had decided to run jointly for the first time. 5 operations sharing labor across a 3-week period, rotating crews between properties. The joint branding was Maris's idea, practically speaking, though she'd introduced it carefully, framed as a question about labor efficiency. The real purpose was social, bringing the operations physically together, mixing the cow hands, having the families work alongside each other. That built something no legal document could build, and she knew it. Documents held when people wanted them to hold. People wanted them to hold when they'd sweated together and eaten together and pulled a stuck calf out of mud at 6 in the morning together. The branding went long and exhausting and imperfect in all the ways large group efforts go imperfect. On the second day at the Crane property, Vic Crane and Dix had a disagreement about roping technique that got loud enough that Lee Crane had to come over and physically redirect his brother toward a different task. Rennie, who had a competitive streak that nobody had figured out how to completely redirect, got into a quiet standoff with one of the Halsey hands over who'd correctly identified a mismatch in the tally count, which turned out to be both of them being partly right and partly wrong. Colton burned his forearm on a branding iron through sheer inattention and spent 2 days with a bandage and a bad temper about it. But by the end of the 3rd week, 647 calves had been branded across 5 properties in less time than any individual property would have managed alone. And the cow hands from different operations were eating together in the evenings with the comfortable ease of people who'd worked hard in proximity and found they could stand each other. Ford, riding back from the last day at Tatum's place, said to Maris, "Tatum's hand, the big one, Abe. He was asking about your grazing rotation. Wanted to know how we do the section timing." What did you tell him? Told him to ask you directly, Ford said. Was that right? That was right, she said. 3 days later, Abe rode over on his own time and asked. She spent an hour with him at the kitchen table going through the system. He asked good questions and took his own notes, which she respected. When he left, he said, Mrs. Mercer, I've been working cattle for 20 years and I haven't thought about grass like that before. I appreciate it. She said he was welcome and he meant it and she meant it, and it was a simple exchange between two people who both understood the work. She thought about it later, not with pride exactly, but with something that recognized it as evidence of a thing she'd believed but hadn't yet fully seen proven. That if you built something genuinely useful, people eventually stopped caring who built it. The mockery didn't disappear because people became enlightened. It became irrelevant because the thing she'd built was more useful than the mockery was entertaining. It was March when Pruitt made his next move, and it was not a subtle one. He filed suit against the cooperative's shared grazing arrangement on the undeeded West Range sections, arguing that the informal grazing claims constituted trespass on territory. He was in the process of acquiring through a separate legal channel a territorial land grant application he'd submitted 6 months earlier that nobody had known about. Dabrowski brought the filing to the Mercer house in person, which was how Maris knew it was serious. He set it on the kitchen table and said, without preamble, "He's been working this for longer than we thought." The land grant application was for approximately 12,000 acres of undeeded West Range territory, the patchy, rough, underloved land that nobody had bothered to claim formally because the process was slow and the land's value wasn't obvious. Pruitt had apparently decided the value was becoming more obvious and had moved first. Maris read the application documents twice. Then she read the territorial land grant law that Dabrowski had brought with him. "The grant isn't approved yet," she said. "No, it's in review. Could be 6 months, could be a year." "Can it be challenged?" "On what grounds?" "Established use," she said. She looked at him steadily. "If we can demonstrate that the cooperative operations have been using this territory consistently and productively prior to his application, grazing, water use, maintenance, we can file a prior use claim that complicates his grant." Dabrowski took his glasses off. "That's a viable argument," he said slowly, "but it requires documentation of prior use that predates his application. He filed 6 months ago. Can you demonstrate consistent use before that?" She went to the shelf. She came back with 3 notebooks, her own records going back 4 years, including 2 years of documenting the Halsey and Tatum operations movement through the West Range sections during her observation period, before the cooperative had even been formalized. She put them on the table. Dabrowski opened the first one. He was quiet for a long time. "You've been recording other operations' grazing patterns," he said. Not an accusation, just recognizing what he was looking at. "My father taught me to record what the land does," she said. "That includes who uses it and how." He looked at the dates. He looked at the detail. He looked at the continuity of records across 4 years of carefully observed use patterns, weather correlations, and land condition notes that would, in a legal proceeding, paint an extremely clear picture of an established and productive land use that predated Pruitt's application by years. He closed the notebook. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I need you to understand that what you have here is not just useful. It is, in legal terms, extraordinary." She said, "How long do we have to file a counterclaim?" 60 days from the suit notification." "Then we should start drafting." They called a cooperative meeting that evening. Everyone rode or drove in, some of them leaving supper half-eaten to get there. Maris laid out the land grant situation the same way she'd laid out the pattern documentation in January. Factual, complete, without manufactured alarm, letting the facts carry the weight. Vic Crane said, "He's been planning this for 6 months. "At least," Maris said. "While we were building the cooperative," Lee Crane said. He wasn't angry. He sounded like a man recalibrating. "He saw us building it," Colton said, "and this is his response. He can't squeeze us individually anymore, so he's trying to take the ground we're standing on." Dale Halsey had his hands flat on the work table. "Can the counterclaim work?" "Dabrowski thinks yes," Maris said. "The prior use documentation is strong. The land grant process requires the applicant to demonstrate that the territory is unoccupied and unproductive. We can show it's neither." She paused. But the counterclaim will cost money. Dabrowski's fees plus filing costs. I'm estimating somewhere between $200 and $250 before it's resolved. The number sat in the room for a moment. For any one operation, it was significant. Across 5, it was manageable. How do we split it? Tatum said. He was already reaching for his coat, which was not where money was kept, but was the gesture of a man who was already past the question of whether. Proportional to acreage, Maris said. That's in the cost-sharing clause. Then let's figure the numbers, Tatum said. They figured the numbers. It took an hour because Vic Crane wanted to understand every component, and Dale Halsey had a question about the proportional calculation that was valid and required a revision. But at the end of the hour, they had a contribution agreement that everyone signed, and Dabrowski had his authorization to proceed. Colton walked outside afterward with Rennie, who had been sitting through the whole meeting with an expression Colton hadn't been able to read. "You all right?" Colton asked. "I've been wrong about her," Rennie said. It came out direct, the way Rennie said things when he finally said them, which was not often, but mattered when he did. "About Maris," Colton said. "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. I don't know what I thought. I thought you got a bad deal and I was waiting for it to show." He looked at the ground. What showed was the opposite of that. Colton didn't say "I told you so" because he hadn't told him. He'd figured it out himself, the same slow way. "She'd appreciate hearing that from you directly," he said. "I know," Rennie said. "I will." He did, the next morning, in the kitchen before anyone else was up. Maris heard him come in and pour himself coffee and then stand there, and she looked up from the rotation notes she was already working on, and he said, "I've been unfair to you, and I wanted to say so." She set down the pen. "Thank you," she said. "I should have said it earlier." "You said it now," she said. "That's not nothing." He nodded and poured her more coffee and sat across from her and asked if he could look at the rotation schedule, and she slid it across the table, and that was that. Not dramatic, not a scene, just the quiet way a relationship that had been stuck finally found its footing. The counterclaim took 4 months to work through the territorial review process. Dabrowski was meticulous, and Maris was available every time he needed something from the documentation, which was often, because the records she'd kept were the spine of the entire legal argument. She drove to Redgate 7 times in those 4 months, sometimes with Colton and sometimes alone. And the county clerk, who had once been professionally neutral and personally sympathetic, was by now professionally neutral and personally admiring, which was a different thing. Pruitt hired a territorial lawyer from the Capitol, a man named Geist, who was expensive and capable, and who argued the grant application on solid technical grounds. It was not a quick or easy process. There were 2 hearings and a supplementary filing and a counterfiling and a period in June where Dabrowski told them honestly that he wasn't certain of the outcome. That was a hard week. Colton didn't sleep well and knew he was short-tempered and tried to account for it with limited success. Maris made the mistake on the 4th day of correcting something he said about the feed numbers in front of Ford, and he snapped at her in a way that was sharper than warranted, and she went very still the way she did, and he knew immediately that he'd done it wrong. That evening he found her in the barn, not doing anything in particular, just standing with one of the horses in the way that meant she needed to be somewhere quiet. "I was a fool today," he said from the door. She didn't say anything for a moment. "You were scared," she said. "So was I." "Doesn't excuse it." "No," she said. "It doesn't." She turned to look at him. "But I know the difference between a man who's scared and striking out and a man who thinks he can treat me that way. You're the first kind." So, he crossed the barn and stood beside her, and she let him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into it, not forgiving him exactly in that moment, because that would come later and more gradually, but choosing the shared weight over the alone weight, which she had been doing since October and which he was still learning was possible to do. "We built something real," he said. "He doesn't get to take it." "No," she said. "He doesn't." The ruling came in July. The Territorial Review Board found in favor of the cooperative's prior use claim. The language of the ruling was careful and dry in the way legal language always is, but what it said, plainly, was that the land had been in productive and consistent use by established operations predating the grant application, that the documentation supporting this was extensive and credible, and that the grant application was therefore denied on established use grounds. Dabrowski sent a letter. It arrived on a Thursday, and Colton read it standing in the yard, and then he read it again, and then he went inside and handed it to Maris without saying anything. She read it once. "Okay," she said. He said, "Okay? I know what it is," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not composure exactly, but was the reaction of a person for whom the win was real, but not a surprise, because she'd built it carefully enough, documented it thoroughly enough, that somewhere in the work she'd stopped being uncertain of the outcome and had only been uncertain of the timing. The win was confirmation, not revelation. Colton laughed, a little baffled, and then he picked her up, which she did not fully expect, and she made a sound that was not quite a protest because she was also, underneath the composure, relieved in the bone-deep way of someone who has been holding their breath for 4 months. He set her down and she straightened her coat, and they were both trying not to grin like idiots with limited success. "We should tell the others," she said. "In a minute," he said. He kissed her then, not for the first time, but with more intention than before, the intention of a man who had run out of reasons to hold things back and had decided the direct route was better. She kissed him back, which settled the question of whether she agreed. The news traveled through the cooperative by end of day. Colton rode to the Halsey place, and Dale Halsey sat on his porch and read the letter summary, and then said, "Nora." And Nora came out and read it, and hugged Dale, and then, unexpectedly, hugged Colton, which he received with the awkwardness of someone who hadn't prepared for that. Tatum heard it from Halsey's hand, Abe, who rode past on other business, and Tatum said nothing at all but sat down on a fence post and put his hat on his knee and looked at the horizon for a long time. Vic Crane said, when Lee told him, 4 months I've been thinking about what I'd do if it went the other way. He paused. What would we have done? I don't know, Lee said, but it didn't go the other way. Because of those notebooks, Vic said. Because of those notebooks, Lee agreed. Harlan Pruitt was in Redgate when the ruling became public, and the county clerk confirmed later, not to anyone in particular, just in the way facts enter the air when they're known, that Pruitt had read the denial without visible reaction, folded it, and left the office without a word to anyone. He went back to his 30,000 acres and his money and his 2 decades of expanding influence, and he sat with the fact that he had met, for the first time, an obstacle he could not move. Not a legal technicality, not a lucky break. A deliberate, documented, strategically constructed obstacle that had been building for 4 years in the notebooks of a woman he'd never bothered to learn the name of until it was too late to make a difference. He tried twice more that year, a water access challenge in September that Dabrowski disposed of in 3 weeks, and a quiet approach to the Harwick buyer that the buyer declined without publicizing, apparently having concluded that a 3-year agreement with the cooperative was more valuable than whatever Pruitt was offering. Both failures were quiet. Neither one moved him to further action, at least not visibly. He was still there, still large, still present, still 30,000 acres of stubborn money. The territory was not a story where the villain departed cleanly, and Maris didn't expect him to. What had changed was the cost-benefit of coming after them, and Pruitt was, above everything else, a man who understood cost and benefit. The fall drive in 1883 was their largest yet, 308 head from the Mercer operation alone, plus the cooperative's combined volume that triggered the Harwick buyer's volume clause for the first time, which meant a better rate per head across the board. The drive took 10 days and was not without problems. One river crossing went badly on the 3rd day, losing 2 steers and costing Dix a bruised shoulder and Cutter a minor cut above his eye that bled dramatically but healed fast. But the herd arrived in better condition than the previous years, and the Harwick buyer shook Colton's hand and then, after a second's consideration, shook Maris's hand as well. Your wife put the volume clause in the original agreement, he said to Colton. I know, Colton said. She knew we'd hit it before you'd run the numbers, the buyer said, not accusingly, just noting. She generally does, Colton said. The buyer looked at Maris. I'd like to discuss next year's terms before you go. I've got thoughts on that already, she said. I expected you did, he said. The ride home from the fall drive was 2 days, and on the first night, camped near a creek with the rest of the hands sleeping around the fire, Colton and Maris sat up later than the others in the particular way that had become their habit, letting the day decompress, talking through the things that didn't get said in the work. He asked her, sometime past midnight, what she was thinking about. She thought for a moment. The east section, she said. We're at capacity for 200 head with the current water and pasture. If we want to grow the herd significantly next year, which the volume clause incentivizes, we need to expand the east section capacity or start using the west range sections more formally. We own the west sections now, effectively. The ruling established prior use. That's not the same as ownership. She paused. We should file formal grazing lease applications through the territory office. Now that the grant denial is on record, our prior use claim is the strongest basis for lease rights in that territory. More Dabrowski, he said. Some, she said. But that kind of filing is simpler once the precedent exists. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. You know that when I met you, I thought... He stopped. I know what you thought, she said. It wasn't one thing, he said. It was a lot of things I'd decided without knowing anything. He looked at her. I think about that sometimes. How close I came to just not listening. But you did listen, she said. Eventually. You made it hard not to, he said, which was as close to elegant as he usually got. She smiled, the small, real one, not the composed public face. I've been making things hard to ignore for a long time, she said. It just usually didn't work. It worked here, he said. It did, she said. She leaned against him, in the easy way of something that had become natural without either of them formally deciding to let it, his arm coming around her, her head settling against his shoulder, both of them looking at the fire. It worked here. The second day home was clear and cold, the kind of fall day that made the territory look like an argument for staying, the light particular and low, the hills rust and gold, the creek catching it. They came over the last ridge and the Mercer place was visible below. The main house, the barn, the repaired outbuilding that had gone up over the summer, the east section fence line running to the hill, the stock pond catching the afternoon light. There it is, Colton said from habit. Maris looked at it for a moment. Their land, the combined land, the thing her father had started and her notebooks had defended and her mind had shaped and her stubbornness had refused to surrender. We need 2 more hands next year, she said. If we're expanding the east section and formalizing the west range leases, we can't do it with the current crew. He looked at her. Can we wait until we're off the ridge, he said. The hiring pool in this territory is thin, she said. If we don't start looking now... Maris. She stopped. He was looking at her with an expression she'd learned to read over 2 years. Not impatient, not dismissive, something warmer and slightly exasperated, and underneath that, something that had no clean name but that she felt when she saw it. 10 minutes, he said. Just look at it for 10 minutes before you start planning what to do with it. She turned back to the valley. The ranch in the late afternoon light, everything they had built, every fight they had won, all of it holding together in the particular stillness of a cold October day. She looked at it for 10 minutes, then she said, 2 hands. One with experience on rough terrain, one younger we can train to our system. He laughed, the full one, the one that reached his eyes. Start looking in November, he said. November, she agreed. They rode down the ridge together, and the land received them as it always did, without ceremony, without sentiment, just the simple fact of them coming home to the thing they'd built on the ground that held it. Edmund was on the porch when they pulled in, wrapped in his coat against the cold. He looked at his son and his daughter-in-law coming in from a successful drive, and what was on his face was not quite pride, because it was larger than pride. The expression of a man who had made a bet with the last good instinct of a long life, and had been proven right in ways he hadn't even imagined when he made it. He said, How'd it go? Colton said, Good. Maris said, Better than good. The volume clause triggered. Edmund nodded slowly. Your father would have liked to see that, he said to her. She got down from her horse and stood in the yard in the cold afternoon light, and thought about Ezra Holloway with his calloused hands, and his worn notebooks, and his 4 oxen, and his box of seed corn planted in the wrong month. Yes, she said. He would have. She took her horse to the barn, and the smoke rose from the chimney in the right direction. She'd had the flue fixed in the spring, and the creek ran steady, and the hills caught the last of the light, and everything that had been called impossible or unreasonable or not how things were done was still standing, still building, still reaching toward the thing it was always going to become. They hired 2 hands in November, the way Maris had said they would. The first was a man named Burl Okafor, 41 years old, who had spent 15 years running cattle through rough hill country in the Northern Territories and had the particular kind of weathered competence that didn't need to announce itself. He interviewed badly, short sentences, no eagerness to impress, which was why 3 other outfits had passed on him that season, and why Colton had almost passed on him too until Maris talked to him for 20 minutes about the West Range terrain, and he answered with the specificity of someone who had actually solved those problems before. "Him," she said, after he'd ridden out. "He barely spoke," Colton said. "He spoke exactly as much as he needed to," she said, "which is different." The second was a 17-year-old named Sam Pryor, youngest of 5 brothers from a failed homestead 2 counties east, who showed up asking for work with a horse that wasn't his and boots that were too big, and an honesty about his inexperience that Maris found more useful than false confidence would have been. She put him with Dix for the first month and told Dix to teach him the rotation system from the beginning, and Dix did it with the patience of a man who had come to understand that the way things were done on this operation was different from how he'd done things before, and that the difference was not arbitrary. By spring of 1884, Sam Pryor knew the pasture rotation better than Cutter, who had 3 more years of experience. Some people learned the shape of a thing faster than others. Maris noted it in her records and began thinking about what to do with him in 2 years, when he'd have enough time on the land to carry real responsibility. She was always thinking 2 years out. It had been her father's habit and had become hers, and she'd stopped apologizing for it. The West Range lease applications went through the territorial office in February, 3 months after Dabrowski filed them. The prior use ruling sat behind them like a foundation, and the applications were approved with less friction than any of them had expected. 12,000 acres of undeeded territory, the rough and patchy land nobody had wanted until they'd proved what could be done with it, was now formally leased across the cooperative's 5 operations, divided by the grazing agreement they'd spent the winter refining with input from all 5 families. Dabrowski sent the approval letters on a Thursday. By Saturday, all 5 operations knew, and Dale Halsey drove over in his wagon with a jar of something he'd made himself that technically wasn't legal but was genuinely good, and they sat on the Mercer porch in the February cold and drank it in small cups and didn't say much because the thing that had happened was too real for ceremony. Vic Crane said, "At one point, when my brother and I came south, I told him we'd make something out here, or we'd lose everything trying. I meant it as a warning." He held his cup. It turned out to be the wrong way to frame it. Nobody asked him to explain. The explanation was visible from the porch, the east section in its winter stillness, the rebuilt outbuilding, the smoke from the barn where Burl was doing something to the tack that he'd claimed needed doing, the fence line running straight to the hill. Harlan Pruitt did not come to that porch. He did not send word or make further legal challenges or find new levers to apply. He existed as he had always existed, at the scale of 30,000 acres and old money and the accumulated weight of 2 decades of getting what he wanted. But the getting had met something it couldn't move, and whatever recalculation happened behind his closed doors in the months after the grant denial, the visible result was that the pressure simply stopped. Not forgiveness, not defeat in any dramatic sense, just the quiet withdrawal of a man who had done the arithmetic and decided the cost wasn't worth it. That was almost more satisfying than a confrontation would have been. The absence of him, the space where the threat used to be, filled now with ordinary work and ordinary days. The spring of 1884 brought their largest branding yet, 812 calves across the cooperative, worked in 3 weeks with 12 hands rotating between properties. Burl ran the West Range sections with a competence that made Colton stop second-guessing the hire within the first 2 days. Sam Pryor worked the rotation schedule with the focus of someone who understood that the schedule was not bureaucracy but biology, that it mapped to what the land needed, not just what was convenient. The east section well held clean and cold through a dry April that worried everyone. The south pasture grass came up 4th year deep-rooted now, genuinely recovered, producing the kind of thick coverage that Colton had not seen on that section in his adult life. He walked it in May, same as he'd walked it every May since Maris had crouched beside him and shown him what shallow roots looked like. And this time the grass came up with roots that went into the ground a full hand's length. He told her that evening. He just said, "The South Pasture," and she looked up from whatever she was writing and understood immediately. "How deep?" she said. He showed her with his hands, the measurement of it. She smiled, the real one. "Good," she said. It was such a small exchange. 2 years of work contained in a hand's width of grass root, communicated in 6 words between 2 people who knew what the other one meant. That was its own kind of language, built slowly and not transferable to anyone who hadn't been there for the building. Edmund Mercer died in the summer of 1884, peacefully, in his bed, at 62, which was not young but was not entirely unexpected given the knees and the weight he'd been carrying in his chest for 2 winters. He died having seen the operation turn, having watched his son become something larger than he'd feared Colton might stay, having watched the woman his old friend had trusted him to protect prove out every reason for that trust. He had said 2 days before to Maris, who was sitting with him in the afternoons now because he'd asked her to, "You turned out to be exactly what Ezra said you were." "What did he say?" she asked. She hadn't known her father had described her to Edmund. "He said you saw the thing behind the thing," Edmund said. He was quiet for a moment. "He said he worried you'd never get the room to use it." She sat with that. "He built me the room," she said, finally. "He just built it in a way he couldn't finish himself." Edmund nodded slowly. "He knew that," he said. "That's why he trusted me with the rest of it." She held his hand for a while in the afternoon quiet, and when he fell asleep she sat there still, thinking about her father and the letter he'd written and the faith he'd had that the right structure, the right arrangement, the right partnership could make room for what she was capable of when none of the individual pieces could do it alone. He had been right. He had been right in the way that patient people are right, not dramatically, not immediately, but with the deep correctness of a thing that takes time to prove but stays proven. She missed him with a steadiness that didn't diminish, and she wrote his name at the front of her current notebook, the way she had with every notebook since his death. Ezra Holloway, who taught me to write down what the land does. Colton grieved his father in the difficult manner of men who weren't raised to have much language for grief. He worked harder for 2 weeks, was quieter than usual, snapped at Ford once, and apologized for it the same day, which was its own kind of progress. He came to Maris one night and didn't say much, just sat beside her, and she let the silence be what it needed to be, which was not empty. Ford took on more operational responsibility in the fall, which had been coming for a while, and which Ford handled with the same methodical competence he'd brought to everything since the day he'd asked Maris if he could help with the rotation notes. He ran the South Range almost independently by October, consulting Maris on the rotation timing and checking with Colton on the major decisions, but otherwise managing the work with a sureness that made both of them aware of how much they'd been carrying and how good it felt to share it. Rennie had surprised them both. He'd taken an interest in the cooperative's broader land management, the West Range sections in particular, and had ridden every acre of the leased territory over the course of the spring and summer, coming back with detailed notes that were less systematic than Maris's but more spatially intuitive. The observations of someone who navigated by feel and retained topography with the natural accuracy of a person who thought in landscapes. He'd found 2 water sources that weren't in any previous survey, both of them on the northwest section, both of them significant. Maris had looked at his notes and said, "How long did it take you to find these?" "The first one I rode past twice before I saw it," he said. "The second one the horses found." "Write down how you knew," she said. "The instinct, not just the location, the process of noticing." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because the instinct is the valuable part," she said. "Location I can put on a map. The way you found it, that's something someone else might need to learn." He wrote it down. It was 3 pages, not very organized, but it was honest about the thinking, which was what she'd asked for, and she kept it with her records. By the fall drive of 1885, the third under the cooperative agreement, they were running 419 head from the Mercer operation and a combined cooperative volume that had the Harwick buyer talking about expanding the agreement for a 5th year. The rate per head was above anything the county had seen in the decade. The West Range leases had added 11,000 workable acres across the cooperative. The water infrastructure, the East Well, the shared agreements with Halsey and Tatum, the two sources Rennie had found, formed a network that could sustain them through drought conditions that would have destroyed them 3 years earlier. At the fall settlement in Redgate, where cattle buyers and sellers gathered each October to finalize agreements and make new ones, Maris sat across a table from 3 different buyers in a single afternoon. She was not, by this point, a curiosity or an anomaly or a subject of anything except ordinary business attention. The attention given to someone who delivers what they say they'll deliver and negotiates without wasted motion. 2 of the buyers had sought her out specifically. Pete Dunnett, who had been watching all of this from his feed store for 3 years, said to his wife that evening, "You know, I can't remember the last time anyone in this county called her anything but Maris Mercer." His wife said, "That's because there's nothing else to call her." He thought about that and couldn't argue with it. The 3 men who had sat on the fence rail outside his store in May of 1882, Harlan Pruitt and his 2-week bet, Pete himself with his 3-month prediction, none of them talked about that morning anymore. Not because they'd agreed to forget it, because the distance between that morning and this October afternoon had become so large that the bet felt like something from a different story, told about different people, in a different territory than the one they were actually standing in. That was the thing nobody had anticipated, not the scale of what the Mercers built, though it was larger than anyone had predicted, but the way the building had changed the territory itself. The cooperative model spread, not immediately, not universally, but in the way useful things spread when people can see them working with their own eyes. One conversation at a time, one shared branding, and one successful drive, and one legal challenge that held because the documentation was there. By 1886, 2 other cooperative arrangements had formed in the county, both of them modeled loosely on the Mercer framework, both of them consulting Dabrowski on structure, and one of them consulting Maris directly on grazing management. She met with them because the territory did better when its land did better, and her father had taught her that the land didn't care who owned it. It responded to how it was treated, full stop. She said as much to the woman who came to see her from the second new cooperative, a rancher named Bet Scorse, who ran the operation jointly with her husband and who had the careful manner of someone who had been told her ideas weren't worth listening to long enough to half believe it. "Your grazing rotation," Bet said. "I've read the notes Dale Halsey shared. Can I ask how you developed it?" "My father started it," Maris said. "I modified it based on observation. 7 years of writing down what the land did and what happened when we changed the inputs." She paused. "The system isn't mine exactly. It's the land's. I just started listening to it carefully enough to take notes." Bet looked at her. Something behind her eyes shifted. The particular shift of a person who has been told their instincts are correct by someone whose instincts have been proven. "I've been watching my east pasture," Bet said. "I think the root systems are shallow." "Probably," Maris said. "Pull up a handful and look at the roots. You'll know right away." She paused. "Then write it down. Today. Before you do anything about it, write down what you see so you have a record of where you started." Bet Scorse went home and pulled up a handful of grass and looked at the roots and wrote down what she saw. She fixed it over the next 2 seasons, and the east pasture recovered, and she told Maris about it the following year with the satisfaction of someone who had done the work and seen it pay. This was not a dramatic story. It did not happen all at once or announce itself, but it happened, operation by operation, notebook by notebook, one careful observation and one honest conversation at a time. Colton, in the fall of 1886, standing in the east section with the late afternoon light on 460 head of cattle in better condition than his grandfather had ever managed on this land, said to Maris, "4 years ago I was ready to lose this." "I know," she said. "And now?" He gestured at the scope of it. "And now," she agreed. He looked at her. "What do you want? For the next 4 years? Not the ranch? What do you want?" She thought about it. She wasn't accustomed to the question being separated that way, the ranch from herself. They were so intertwined in her daily life that she had to deliberately pull them apart to find the answer underneath. "I want to write the system down properly," she said. "Not just my notebooks, something a person could read and use. The rotation principles, the documentation method, the water management, something with enough detail to be actually useful." She paused. "And I want a real root cellar. The one we have is too small and floods in wet years." He stared at her. "Out of everything, a root cellar." "A proper one," she said, "with drainage." He laughed, startled and genuine. "The root cellar first," he said, "then the book." "The book first," she said, "then the root cellar. I can work around a small cellar. I can't get back the time I spend trying to remember what I already figured out." He conceded the book because he was a man who had learned the difference between an argument worth having and one that was simply the friction of two people who didn't agree on sequencing, and because she was right that the documentation mattered, that the things she'd built in her notebooks had saved them as concretely as any fence or well or legal filing. She wrote it over the winter of 1886, working in the evenings after everything else was done, in the small room she'd taken over as an office. The old storage room she'd cleared herself in the first week of the marriage, now lined with her notebooks and the property files and Dabrowski's letters and Ezra Holloway's original survey notes, all of it organized in the precise, purposeful way of a mind that had learned to impose order on complicated systems because complicated systems were where she lived. It was not a short document. It was not always elegant. There were sections she rewrote 4 times and sections she finished in a single sitting, and there were nights she went to bed frustrated with her own ability to put into words things that were clear in her head and translated badly to the page. Colton read it in sections as she finished them. He said once, "This part about the drought response rotation, you should tell the story about the South Pasture, what it looked like when we first looked at the roots versus what it looks like now. The before makes the after mean something." She looked at him. "That's actually right," she said. "I've been known to be right occasionally," he said. She added the South Pasture story. It made the drought response section better, the before and after, the specific detail of roots that broke in your hand versus roots that went into the ground a full hand's length. The particular observable truth of a thing recovered. She dedicated the document to Ezra Holloway. Holloway, without ceremony, just his name and the date of his death, and what he'd told her. Write down what the land does. The root cellar went in the following spring, properly drained, properly sized, built by Burrell and Sam Pryor and Ford, over 3 weeks in March with Rennie doing the finish work on the drainage channel, which he did with the spatial intuition he'd proved on the West Range. On the day it was finished, Maris went down into it and stood in the clean, cold dark for a moment, smelling the earth. This was what things felt like when they were built right. Not the absence of problems, not the end of difficult work, but the particular solidity of a foundation that could hold what you put on it. Imperfect in the small ways all built things were imperfect. Sound in the ways that mattered. She thought about the courthouse in Redgate, 12 minutes and 20 people. She thought about the 3 men on the fence rail and their bets about 2 weeks, about 3 months, about how long before Colton came to his senses and how long before this whole enterprise collapsed into the obvious failure everyone had pre-assigned it. She thought about what they had actually built instead, the water network and the pasture rotation and the cooperative and the legal record and the document she'd written and the 2 new cooperatives using the framework and Betty Scorse's East Pasture coming back from shallow roots and Sam Pryor knowing the land by its logic rather than its habit. And Rennie's 3 pages about how he found water and Ford running the South Range with a sureness that would only grow. None of it was finished. None of it would be. That was the nature of a living operation, a living piece of land. It required constant attention, constant documentation, constant willingness to be wrong and update and keep going. But it was real. Undeniably, documentably, measurably real. She came up from the cellar and Colton was standing in the yard, watching her come out of it with a look that contained, she had learned to read, several things at once, the practical satisfaction of a completed project and something older than that, the particular regard of a man who had been given something he hadn't known how to value and had learned, not without difficulty, what it was actually worth. "Well?" he said. "Drainage is good," she said. "Burrell got the channel angle right." "Is that the only thing worth saying about it?" She looked at him. The afternoon light was the same low fall light she remembered from the first October, riding back from the courthouse with the town falling away behind them, the silence between them uncertain and careful and full of potential that neither of them had language for yet. They had language for it now, a lot of it. It's what we said we'd do, she said. Build something no one can destroy. He crossed the yard and stood beside her in the light. We're not done building, he said. No, she agreed. We're not. That was not a flaw in the story. That was the story. The building didn't stop because you'd proven you could build. It kept going because that was what building was. You laid one true thing on top of another, and you wrote it down, and you kept the records, and you moved into the next season with everything you'd learned in the last one, and you tried to see the thing behind the thing. Some days you failed. Some seasons the land gave you less than you needed, and you worked with less. Some partnerships cracked and had to be repaired. Some plans proved wrong and had to be revised. Some silences in the night were not peace, but the sound of worry running without anywhere to go. But the roots held. In the South Pasture and the East Section and the West Range and the Cooperative and the document and the notebook stacked on the shelf in the old storage room, in all of it, the roots held. And the cattle moved in the long grass in the October light, 460 head on land that had been listened to carefully enough to give back more than anyone had asked of it. And the territory lay quiet under a clear sky, and everything that had been built stood in the ordinary way of things that are built to last, without ceremony, without announcement, just present and solid and exactly where it was supposed to be.